Hello.
Hi.
Welcome back. Thanks so much for tuning in. And today we're doing an interesting video. We're going to go over some background information of Tourette syndrome.
Yep.
And some of the history, things like that. So
well, no history, really.
There's a tiny bit.
Okay. But a little bit of background with it. We, mainly him, did the research ourselves, so we can't be 100% sure if this is accurate or not. We tried our best, again,
to find,
mainly him,
to find credible
sources. Obviously, some of the stuff later in this can be taken many different ways, but it's what we could find. It's what we wanted to do this week. We are curious with it. So
yeah, we, in the process of teaching you guys some stuff, we were also able to teach ourselves things as well. And so hopefully we can relay that information in a way that you guys can understand and find informative and useful. If you want to have a more brief overview of Tourette syndrome, a more personal overview, I should say.
More specific.
Yeah, we filmed a video with kind of more personal comments about Tourette syndrome and what it is in a video called What It's Like Having Tourette Syndrome. So you can find that on our channel. And yeah, we'll jump right into it then. So I'll let you go ahead and talk about just kind of where Tourette syndrome all started and where it came from.
So in 1825 was the first reported case of Tourette syndrome by a French doctor. Don't exactly have his name, but it was later understood that the woman that had this actually had coprolalia instead of, or
she
with Tourette's,
yeah,
or instead
combined
of
with Tourette syndrome, because a lot of times you find that that's almost an extension of Tourette syndrome. And coprolalia involves swearing, it involves uttering of obscene words and other socially inappropriate remarks.
Kind of yelling out in the middle of places, in public places, is usually what it winds up being, or what you wind up seeing it more as, because you don't see home life with that one as much.
Yeah, it's quite uncommon. A lot of times you will experience parts of coprolalia. Even myself, I experienced it a little bit growing up when my Tourette's was at its worst. And it's not fun, but it's something that is very real. And a lot of times you will find that's what many videos and things can, I don't want to use the word mock, but
that's what it is,
in
though.
a sense that that is what it is. And that's what you find. That's the way they display Tourette syndrome, as people, you know, swearing and saying things that are obscene.
Yeah, I think that's what most people think of when they think of Tourette's, is that they think of the yelling out of swear words. Yeah. Even though it's not.
It's much less common than most tic disorders that you'll find in Tourette syndrome itself. But her name was, and excuse me if I butcher this, it was Marquise de Dampierre. And she was the first reported case of Tourette syndrome. Now, at that point, it was not defined as Tourette syndrome. So later in 1885, a French doctor named Georges Gilles de la Tourette, which was what Tourette syndrome was named after, that is when they were actually able to find that first case as Tourette syndrome itself. And we believe that that same case from 1825 was the same lady, and that she was the same one who actually had the confirmed case of Tourette syndrome.
They were both described as a high woman of nobility, both in France, and I think both of them defined it as like it was against her character as a noble woman, and it just went off to describe that it wasn't appropriate for a woman of this standing.
Exactly.
And so that's how we believe it was the same one.
Yeah, and it all just kind of connected in that sense.
Yeah.
So
Tourette's syndrome is obviously an inherited gene. It is a 50% chance of it being inherited, and it can be passed from either parent. Technically, they did say in a couple things that it could skip generations, but it's not as common to.
Yeah, it is defined as a dominant gene as well. So in that way, it again can be passed from either parent to their child. Boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to display symptoms of Tourette syndrome, and that I have known as something to be more common. And so in that sense, girls are less likely to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome.
Essentially, just like autism with Tourette syndrome, girls are better at masking things, or there's still a little bit of doctors that believe that girls can't get these disorders, and so they either get misdiagnosed as just a plain old tic disorder, or they just get completely looked over to the point of being, nah, your gender can't have it.
Yeah.
Women can't have it.
Well, I was gonna say, and we know someone who had trouble getting diagnosed.
She still isn't officially diagnosed, or they still aren't officially diagnosed. They're 16, and the whole family knows that it's Tourette's, but the doctor will not diagnose them.
Yeah. But I guess moving forward, Tourette syndrome is usually noticed in early childhood. So for me, that was definitely the case. I was around 7-8 years old when I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. Fortunately, I did not have to go through much trouble to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, as I was pretty quickly able to find out. I think there was a little bit of unsureness.
And how many of your siblings had?
Yeah, I had minor tics. Almost all of them had some form of a motor tic. I know my brother in specific dealt with them up to kind of the age that I was diagnosed, but his started to go away after a while, as well as my sister too. But it's quite common to have symptoms of tics early when you're younger, and usually in this you'll hear it from all different types of doctors. You'll grow out of it, and for me it just wasn't the case.
There's always a small chance that things will be grown out of, but as we have said before, Tourette syndrome is kind of like a moon cycle where it waxes and wanes a lot.
Oh yeah.
And so it could be just dormant for years and then all of a sudden come back.
Yeah.
So
it's estimated that 200,000 Americans have the most severe form of Tourette syndrome, and that being something where there's a more complex variation of motor tics, vocal tics. And so it's really not a high number of people that have a more severe form of Tourette syndrome. Although Tourette syndrome can be a chronic condition, and most of the time symptoms last throughout people's lifetimes, whether they're mild or severe. And again, like you said, it waxes and wanes, so it can vary at times. Most younger teens experience the worst of symptoms, and they tend to become milder as you move into your late teens and adulthood, which I would say is true for my case as well. Things definitely got worse as I moved into adolescence, and then as I moved into late teens and adulthood. I'm not saying that they completely got better, but things started to move in the right direction, and with the help of medication and other things as well. So it's true to a certain extent, but that's just the way that it tends to evolve, I should say.
I mean, you still have your cycles of it, like you said, but it can generally relieve a little bit as you get older.
Yeah. And so this is kind of moving on to more of the sciencey portion of Tourette syndrome. So we did our best to display this in a way that makes more sense to you guys, and hopefully you can find this informative and useful, but hopefully it's not super boring either. So Tourette syndrome is believed to be caused by a defect of the 13th chromosome, and it's of the gene SLITRK1. And this isn't completely certain, but it's what they believe to be part of the defect that actually causes these symptoms to arise in people that end up having Tourette syndrome. Current research also points to abnormalities in the regions of the brain, including the basal ganglia, the frontal lobes, and the cortex. And because I'm not even well versed in these parts of the brain, I actually did a little extra research, and I wanted to figure out where these parts of the where these parts of the brain were, and also what their effects are on our bodies. So the frontal lobe, which is right here, is located in the front of your brain. It is responsible for voluntary movement, cognitive skills such as planning and organizing, and other higher level brain functions. And then the basal ganglia is located deep in the hemispheres of your brain. So it's kind of in the center, real deep in your brain. And that is responsible for motor control, movement control. Motor control is movement control, as well as other behaviors and emotions. The disruption of the area of this brain can be responsible for various movement disorders such as Tourette syndrome. And that's a common one that usually coincides with Tourette syndrome, is disruptions in the basal ganglia. So if you've heard someone talk about Tourette syndrome, what causes it, a lot of times you'll hear that part of the brain being brought up. And then lastly, we have the cortex of the brain. This is the wrinkly outermost layer of the brain, and it is responsible for functions such as attention awareness, memory, and language, as well as a few other things. So those three parts of the brain are the most common parts of the brain to be involved in the symptoms of Tourette syndrome and what causes those symptoms of Tourette syndrome. And then, as well as, this is moving into the neurotransmitters, the communication of your brain, is including dopamine, GABA, and serotonin. One in particular is the GABA neurotransmitter, and this is responsible for sending chemical messages through your brain and nervous system, so communication again, and is involved in regulating that communication through brain cells. And it plays an important role in GABA plays an important role in our behavior cognition, so thinking, remembering, judging, and problem solving, and the body's response to stress as well. And I thought that was really interesting. So it actually involves, or it coincides with the response to stress with our body. And research also shows that GABA helps to control fear and anxiety. So that's a huge one. When they did an MRI test on people, in a research study, they found that the people with Tourette syndrome actually had reduced levels of GABA, up to 50%. So people with Tourette syndrome, they found that these levels of this neurotransmitter were actually reduced. And studies show that in adolescence, changes in the brain contribute to increased levels of the neurotransmitter GABA. So what I'm saying there is, as people grew out of adolescence and the brain is changing and forming and stuff still, they actually found that GABA increases. So over time, and this is tying into where we talked about as you move into your later teens and adulthood, you find that the symptoms of Tourette syndrome start to reduce a little bit. And so it actually helps to this increase in GABA as your brain is changing and growing, gives the ability to curb the prevalence of these tics when you're moving into adulthood. And so that was, I know that was quite a bit to take in, but that is kind of how the brain and your body functions in response to Tourette syndrome. And then, so hopefully, again, you found that a little bit informative and it wasn't too boring going through that. But as of right now, there is no specific test to diagnose Tourette syndrome. So you can't simply go to the doctor and take a blood work or, do an MRI and say this person has Tourette syndrome. It's not as simple as that. It is actually, they use certain criteria that is used to diagnose Tourette syndrome. So part of that criteria is both having motor and vocal tics, So you have to have a combination of both. They don't necessarily have to be happening at the same time, though it's they definitely happen at the
Most
same
common.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you'll see with my tics, I have motor and vocal tics that happen at the same time all the time. But it doesn't necessarily, for the sake of running through these specific criteria, they don't have to happen at the same time. And they need to be present for at least a year. That one's a pretty common one that most people know about when it comes to diagnosing Tourette syndrome, is it does need to be present for at least a year, and the tics need to have been present before the age of 18 years old. So again, you can't just go in and say, can you do a test? Do I have Tourette syndrome? They usually run through those criteria. So that then leads into what we were talking about, where you can't, it's hard for doctors to diagnose it, and they tend to want to steer away from it because they might think sniffling or something like that has to do with some sort of sickness. Eye blinking has to do with a vision problem.
Or even the fact that, I mean, you do it quite often. It's when you get into that environment of being in the office or being around a doctor, you don't really know them. You tend to hide more of it.
Yep.
You tend
It's
to
true. Suppress.
Thank you. That was the word
Yeah.
I was saying. So you tend to suppress a lot of it. And it just becomes something that if they don't see it,
it hinders the ability to be able to actually diagnose
and
it.
there will be some doctors that I've known that have said, oh, well, it didn't happen here, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. And then moving forward, there is no specific cure for Tourette syndrome, unfortunately. And there are many ways to cope with Tourette syndrome. So that is, I guess it's kind of a win-lose situation, but unfortunately they are not, you can't at this point say they're tried and true, because, you have things like behavioral therapy, such as habit reversal. And that is the idea of taking certain motor and vocal tics and changing those tics to supplement it with a different type of tic. So if you jerk your arm or something like that, you might be able to use habit reversal training to be able to turn that tic into clenching your fist instead. And it turns a more socially unacceptable tic into something that you would consider more socially acceptable. That's a pretty common one. You'll find a lot of research on habit reversal training. I've tried some of it, but it is tough to work through because it takes a lot of work. You are literally having to retrain your brain. And for me, that's, 15 plus years of having some of the same tics since when I was younger, and having to retrain those pathways in your brain and turn it into something different. And that can prove to be very tough at times. Other options are medications. Those are super common. There's many different types of medications. I'm sure many of you that have Tourette syndrome have probably tried different medications before. But again, there's no tried and true medication that works, that fixes. There's nothing that's a cure-all for Tourette syndrome. But there are definitely ones that have basically almost completely cured people of Tourette syndrome.
Well, and it's more of helping with the side effects of it.
Yeah.
So with the anxiousness of it, or
depression.
Yep.
All different types of, like you're saying, things that go along with Tourette syndrome.
It's not specifically for Tourette syndrome, but it is other things that go with it that wind up being making
it easier to cope with the tics. Yeah. So medication, and then another option is another type of behavioral therapy, which is called neurofeedback. And this actually helps to teach self-control of the brain. And this is through taking abnormal brain waves and regulating them. So it's through 3 different types of senses. I actually do neurofeedback right now. And it's touch, sound, and sight. And it takes sound waves, and it uses those in combination with your natural brain waves, and it, in a sense, retrains the brain to be able to work differently in certain situations. And so it can be used, you know, to help with tics. It can be used to help, again, like you're saying, with things that go along with Tourette syndrome, anxiety, depression, headaches. That doesn't necessarily go along with Tourette syndrome, but it's another thing that you can treat.
That a lot of people do it for anger management.
Yep.
Anything that is more rooted in your brain, that is more of, I don't want to use the word habit, but that's the only thing I can think of right now.
I mean, it's a good way to describe it, but it's habitual. And it truly is, because it's a pathway that's built in your brain. It's just the way your brain is wired.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's no cure for it. There's ways to cope with it. And we've all, unfortunately, have had to learn that the hard way, that for us who have dealt with any type of thing, you know, from anxiety to Tourette syndrome to schizophrenia.
Best is finding a good support system.
Yeah. Yeah, finding good people to surround yourself with and using some of those coping strategies to see if they help you in your specific situation. So that was a lot to go over, and it was, like we said, it was fun. We enjoyed being able to research that and learn a little bit for ourselves as well. Because I'll be honest, I've never really taken the time to understand Tourette syndrome as much as I should, and being able to really dig deep and find that information that helps you to realize some of the truths behind Tourette syndrome and different tic disorders is quite interesting. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and again, found it informative or useful for yourselves, and hopefully it made sense. We did our best to try and translate this into something that's more user-friendly. And yeah, anything else you wanted to add? No? Well, we really do appreciate you guys watching the video, and we thank you so much for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We try to provide as much content as we can weekly. Just, you know, our daily lives, a lot to do with Tourette syndrome. We have quite a few videos already that we filmed, and we just want to try and be, you know, a beacon of light to you guys, and with whatever you're struggling with, and try and help provide support. And that's what we're here for. So,
yes.
Yes, we are.
Sorry.
No, you're good. So thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you guys in the next video. See ya.
Bye.